Mr. Jonathan, maybe this can wait a few days.
No, it can't.
Jonathan! Come on, man, this doesn't feel right. You want to pay her salary yourself?
Yeah.
You understand, don't you?
Your father knew this day would come. What does that mean? You'll find out soon enough.
Oh, what is that?
Something your father trusted me with.
She had spent 38 years keeping that house alive. 38 years of early mornings, cold winters, quiet sacrifices, and a loyalty so deep it never once asked for anything in return. And the moment the man she had served with her whole heart was lowered into the ground, his children packed her belongings into garbage bags, walked her to the front door, and told her she was no longer welcome. She stood on those front steps without a single word of protest. No argument, no tears, just one quiet look back at the mansion she had cared for longer than some of those children had been alive. And then she said something that nobody understood that day. She said, "Your father knew this day would come." 3 days later, the family lawyer opened the will, and everything changed. Before we go any further, we'd love to know where in the world you're watching this from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you're new here, click that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one, we bring them to you every week. Now, let's go back to where the story truly begins. The year was 1986. Ronald Reagan was in the White House. The stock market was climbing. And a woman named Evelyn Carter was 26 years old, newly arrived in Connecticut from a small town in rural Georgia, with a cardboard suitcase, $60 folded into her shoe, and a job offer she could barely believe was real. She had answered a small ad in the back of a local newspaper. A private household in Greenwich, Connecticut was looking for a live-in housekeeper. The estate was owned by a man named Charles Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Industrial Holdings, one of the fastest-growing manufacturing conglomerates on the East Coast. Evelyn had never seen a house that big in her life. When the black iron gates swung open and she saw the grounds for the first time, the manicured hedges, the stone fountain, the 4-car garage, the east and west wings stretching out like something from a movie, she almost turned around and went back home. Almost, but she didn't. And that one decision, that quiet act of courage from a 26-year-old woman with $60 in her shoe, would eventually reshape the fate of one of the wealthiest families in New England. Charles Whitmore was 51 years old when Evelyn arrived at the mansion. He was not a warm man by nature. He was precise, disciplined, built from the same hard granite that Connecticut winters produce in people who refuse to break. His wife, Margaret, was the warmth in that household. She was the one who showed Evelyn her room, made sure she had towels and enough to eat, and told her quietly on that first evening, "We don't treat people like furniture here." Those words stayed with Evelyn for the rest of her life. The Whitmore children at the time were teenagers. Jonathan was 17, tall, already rehearsing the arrogance of a man who had been told his whole life that the world would bend for him. Vanessa was 15, sharp, competitive, always watching for weakness in everyone around her. Michael was 13, the quietest of the three, but quietly the most troubled. He had his father's eyes and his mother's longing. A dangerous combination when nothing in the house ever seemed to be enough. Evelyn learned quickly that her job was not simply to cook and clean. In a house that big, with people that complicated, a housekeeper becomes something else entirely. She became the one who noticed when Michael hadn't eaten dinner for 3 days because he was too embarrassed to say he was failing math. She became the one who stayed up past midnight with Margaret during her first bout with illness in 1991. Holding a cold cloth to her forehead and humming old hymns from Georgia because nothing else was working. She became the one who covered for Jonathan the night he came home at 2 in the morning smelling like a bar, quietly removing the evidence before Charles made his 6 a.m. rounds. She never asked for gratitude. She never asked for anything. And can we stop for a moment and ask you something? Have you ever had someone in your life who gave everything they had to a situation and was completely invisible to the people who benefited most from them? Maybe a parent, maybe a teacher, maybe someone at work. Because that is exactly what Evelyn Carter was inside that house. Completely present, completely invisible, and completely taken for granted. The years moved forward the way they do when you're too busy surviving to count them. Margaret Whitmore passed away in the spring of 1998 from complications following surgery. She was 61 years old. The night before she died, Margaret held Evelyn's hand in that hospital room and said something that Evelyn never fully repeated to anyone. Whatever those words were, Evelyn walked out of that hospital with her jaw set and her eyes dry. She went back to the mansion. She prepared the house for grief. She cooked for 2 weeks straight while Charles sat in his study and didn't speak. She managed the flower arrangements, the visitors, the correspondence, the cold casseroles that neighbors kept dropping off. She did all of it while the children flew in from their various lives. Jonathan from New York, Vanessa from Boston, Michael from wherever Michael happened to be that month. And she watched them grieve the way wealthy people often do, loudly and briefly, before returning to the business of their own lives. After Margaret died, the house changed. It became quieter in a way that felt less like peace and more like absence. Charles began working longer hours. He trusted fewer people. But he trusted Evelyn more. Not with his emotions. Charles Whitmore was not the kind of man who talked about emotions. He trusted her with the things that actually mattered to him. He trusted her to keep his home the way it had always been kept. He trusted her with his schedule, his correspondence, his privacy. Occasionally, very occasionally, she would find him sitting alone in the kitchen late at night, and they would drink coffee in silence, and sometimes he would say something small and real, something he would never say to a boardroom or a child. I wonder sometimes if I built all of this for the right reasons. Or, Margaret was the only person I ever really talked to. Or simply, I'm glad you're still here, Evelyn. She never pressed him. She never tried to make those moments into something they weren't. She just stayed. That was her way. Now here is where the story begins to carry weight that most people would never suspect from the outside. The year was 2003. Whitmore Industrial Holdings was in serious trouble. The details were not public. Charles made absolutely sure of that. But internally, the company was staring into a financial collapse that could have wiped out nearly everything he had built over 4 decades. There had been a systematic embezzlement operation running inside the company's regional accounts division for 3 years. A mid-level executive named Gary Hollis had been siphoning funds through shell accounts, slowly, carefully, in amounts just small enough to stay beneath the automated audit thresholds. By the time the damage was calculable, the company was facing potential losses that could have triggered a cascade. Creditors calling in loans, board members losing faith, competitors circling. The legal and reputational damage alone could have been catastrophic. How was it discovered? Not by the auditors, not by the CFO, not by the expensive consulting firm Charles had brought in the previous year. It was discovered by Evelyn. She had been shredding old documents in Charles's home office one afternoon, a routine task, when she noticed a discrepancy in a set of printed financial summaries that had been left on the desk. She did not have a finance degree. She did not have a business background. But she had been living inside that man's professional life for 17 years. She knew how his reports looked. She knew how his numbers sat on a page. And something was wrong. She did not confront Charles directly. She was not the kind of woman who did things that way. Instead, she quietly made a copy of the document. She kept it. She waited, and over the following 2 weeks, she noticed 3 more documents that didn't sit right. On a Tuesday evening in September, she placed a folder on Charles's desk with a handwritten note that said simply, I may be completely wrong, but I think you should look at this. Charles looked at it. He called his private attorney that same night. Within 60 days, Gary Hollis was arrested. The embezzlement was stopped. The company was quietly stabilized. And Charles Whitmore, for only the second time in his life, sat down at the kitchen table, put his face in his hands and wept. Evelyn made him coffee. She sat across from him. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Charles asked her what she wanted in return. A raise? A bonus? He could set her up in a property of her own. He could make sure she never had to work another day in her life. Evelyn looked at him and said, I don't need anything, Mr. Charles. I just didn't want to see what you built get taken from you. And she meant it. Every single word. And we need to ask you again, because this matters. If you had been in Evelyn's position, would you have said something? Or would you have kept your head down and stayed out of it? Would you have risked your job, your home, your security, to protect a man who employed you? Because most people would have looked the other way. Evelyn didn't. And that choice, that one quiet, invisible act of integrity, would echo through the next 2 decades in ways no one could have predicted. Charles never forgot what Evelyn did. But he also never told his children about it. Not Jonathan, not Vanessa, not Michael. He had his reasons for that. He knew his children well, perhaps too well. He knew that Jonathan would find a way to use the information to position himself. He knew Vanessa would resent the fact that a housekeeper had done something none of them had managed to do. He knew Michael, deep in whatever financial or personal trouble he was always navigating, might try to leverage it somehow. So Charles kept it between himself and his attorney. He kept it private. He kept it protected. And then, very carefully, very deliberately, over the years that followed, he began to put things in place. In 2009, Charles established what his attorney would later describe only as a private family trust structure. The details were sealed. The beneficiaries were not publicly recorded. The children were unaware of its existence. Charles continued running his company until 2018, when he handed day-to-day operations to a board of directors and began what everyone assumed was a quiet retirement. He was 83 years old. He had a heart condition that had been managed for 6 years. He walked more slowly. He sat in the garden more often. And Evelyn was there. Every morning. Every evening. She made sure his medication was taken. She made sure the kitchen smelled like something warm. She kept the house the way Margaret had kept it. Alive, dignified, cared for. In the spring of 2024, Charles Whitmore died in his sleep. He was 89 years old. The death was not unexpected. His doctor had quietly indicated in the weeks prior that time was short, but it still moved through the household like a cold wind. Evelyn had been the one to find him that morning. She had stood in the doorway of his bedroom for a long moment, looked at the stillness of the man she had known for 38 years, and then she had done what she always did. She had gone downstairs, picked up the telephone, and taken care of what needed to be taken care of. The children arrived within hours, and almost immediately, something changed in the air. Jonathan Whitmore was the first to speak to the household staff as a group. He was 55 now, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who took up space deliberately. He stood in the main foyer and announced that there would be significant changes to the household budget and staffing structure, effective within the week. He did not look at anyone when he spoke. He looked at the ceiling, as if the staff were not quite worth the effort of eye contact. Vanessa, 53, moved through the rooms with a notepad making assessments. She paused to examine the antique furniture, the paintings, the silverware. She had the careful eyes of someone appraising, not mourning. Michael, 51, spent most of the first afternoon on his phone, speaking quietly in corners. He had the distracted energy of a man managing multiple crises at once. The funeral was held 4 days after Charles's death. It was a large service. Over 300 people attended. Business associates, former board members, local politicians, old neighbors. Multiple people stood at the podium and described Charles Whitmore as principled, demanding, visionary, loyal. Evelyn sat in the back row. She wore a dark gray dress and her good coat, the wool one she kept for occasions. She did not speak at the service. Nobody asked her to. She listened to the eulogies and she kept her hands folded in her lap, and she thought about a Tuesday evening in September 2003 and a cup of coffee that had gone cold on the kitchen table. Less than 24 hours after the funeral, Jonathan called a meeting with the household staff and told them their positions were being terminated with 2 weeks severance. He was matter-of-fact about it. He said the estate would be transitioning and that there was no need for a full household staff going forward. Then he turned to Evelyn specifically and said that her arrangement, the live-in position, the private room on the 3rd floor that she had occupied for 38 years, would need to be vacated within 48 hours. Vanessa added, without looking up from her phone, that Evelyn should feel free to keep any personal items that were gifts. Michael said nothing. He was already back on his phone. Evelyn listened. She nodded. She thanked them. She went upstairs to pack. They did not offer to help. They did not offer a larger severance. Jonathan personally brought garbage bags to her door, as if 38 years of a person's life could be measured by how much space it took up inside a bag. The other staff members, a driver named Terrence who had been with the family for 9 years, a gardener named Luis who had been there for 12, watched with a quiet shame they didn't quite know what to do with. Terrence offered to drive Evelyn wherever she needed to go. She thanked him and said she'd take a cab. She carried her bags down the stairs herself. She didn't ask for help. She walked through the main foyer she had swept and polished 10,000 times. She walked out the front door. She stood on the stone steps, those same wide stone steps that had been photographed for 3 magazine features about the estate over the years, and she turned back and looked at the mansion one last time. The building she had kept alive for 4 decades. The place where she had held a dying woman's hand. The kitchen where she had made coffee for a broken man. The bedroom where she had once covered a teenager with a blanket at 2 in the morning, so his father wouldn't smell the alcohol. She looked at it for a long time, and then she said it. Your father knew this day would come. Jonathan was standing in the doorway. He heard it. He didn't respond. He closed the door. Now think about that for a moment. Not the cruelty of it, though that is real. Think about what it means when a person can stand in a moment of complete humiliation and feel absolutely no fear. Because Evelyn Carter did not look like a woman who had just lost everything. She looked like a woman who knew exactly where she was going. And she did. Because before she left the front steps, she did something that nobody inside the mansion was watching for. She bent down near the large stone flower pot to the right of the front entrance, the one planted with white hydrangeas that Margaret had chosen herself 30 years ago, and she slid her fingers along the base of the pot. Tucked beneath it, taped to the underside, was a small brass key with a piece of tape on it. On the tape, in Charles's careful handwriting, were 4 words, "When the time comes." He had told her about it 2 years earlier. He had sat beside her in the garden and explained that there was a key, and that there was a safety deposit box at a specific branch of a specific bank in Hartford, and that she was to go there after his death and not before. She had not asked why. She had simply nodded and said she understood. That night, Evelyn Carter checked into a modest hotel in Hartford. She had enough saved for 2 weeks, maybe 3, and she sat on the edge of the bed and she held that small brass key in her palm and she thought about a 60-year-old man sitting at a kitchen table with his face in his hands. And she slept. The next morning, she went to the bank. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this amazing story. The safety deposit box contained 4 things. The first was a bundle of handwritten letters, 41 of them, dated across 15 years, addressed to each of his 3 children and to Evelyn herself. The second was a set of financial documents, including the original records from the 2003 embezzlement case, with a detailed account of exactly what Evelyn had discovered and how she had reported it. The third was a collection of photographs, images of the household across the decades, Christmases and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons, people and moments that most of the Whitmore children probably hadn't thought about in years. And the fourth was a sealed envelope. On the outside of that envelope, in Charles's handwriting, were the words, "To be opened only if my children forget who built this family." Evelyn did not open the envelope. She sat with it for a long time. She read her own letter. We don't know exactly what it said. She has never shared the specific contents. But people who know Evelyn say that after she read it, she sat quietly for a very long time, and when she finally stood up, she looked different. Not relieved. Not vindicated. Just settled. Like something that had been slightly off balance for a very long time had finally been put right. She placed everything carefully back in the box. She took the sealed envelope. And she called Charles's attorney. His name was Walter Gaines. He had managed Charles Whitmore's legal affairs for 22 years. He was 70 years old, recently retired, and he answered Evelyn's call on the second ring as if he had been waiting for it. Because he had. The will reading was scheduled for 10 days after Charles's death. The children arrived at Walter Gaines's Hartford office with their own attorneys. Jonathan had a firm from New York. Vanessa had hired someone from Boston. Michael came alone, which Walter later noted told you something. They sat in the conference room with the expectation of people who had been waiting a long time for a guaranteed prize. There was small conversation. There was coffee that nobody really drank. And then Walter opened the document and began to read. The early sections were largely expected. The main residence and its contents would go into a managed estate. Certain financial accounts were divided among the 3 children on an equitable basis. Jonathan would receive the Connecticut property upstate. Vanessa would receive a portfolio of investments. Michael would receive a structured settlement paid in installments over 10 years. Charles had built that structure deliberately, for reasons anyone who knew Michael would understand. And then Walter turned to the final section. And the room went quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet before. Walter read, "In the spring of 2003, this company came within 30 days of a collapse that would have destroyed everything I spent 40 years building. It was not saved by my board of directors. It was not saved by my auditors. It was not saved by my children, who at that time were building their own lives and did not know what was happening. It was saved by a woman named Evelyn Carter, who was employed in my household as a housekeeper, and who possessed the integrity, the courage, and the quiet intelligence to notice something that everyone else missed, and to bring it to my attention without drama, without agenda, and without asking for anything in return. Jonathan looked up from the document. Vanessa stopped writing. Michael's phone went face down on the table. Walter continued, I did not tell my children about this at the time because I knew them too well. I knew that the knowledge would be used, weaponized or resented or simply absorbed into the background of their privilege without ever being truly understood. I wanted them to hear it the right way, at the right moment, in a room where they could not look away from it. The room was very still. Evelyn Carter saved this family, not once, but hundreds of times across 38 years, in ways large and small, seen and unseen. She was present at every difficulty. She stayed through every failure. She gave this family more loyalty and more dignity than most of us will ever fully deserve. And she did it without complaint, without expectation, without even the basic acknowledgement that she had earned 10 times over. Then Walter set down the printed document and picked up the sealed envelope, the one with the handwriting on the outside. He opened it and read the final words that Charles Whitmore had written before his death. If you are hearing this letter being read in full, then my children have already shown you exactly the people they became when they thought no one was watching. Evelyn predicted this day to me once. She never said it to diminish you. She said it because she knew you. She loved you. And she understood that sometimes the people who love us most are the ones we hurt worst, because we believe they will always be there no matter what we do to them. She was always there. I am asking you now, as your father, and as someone who will not be able to ask you anything after this, to be worthy of the person she chose to be. And then Walter read the final clause of the will. Evelyn Carter was named as the chairperson of the Whitmore Family Charitable Trust, a private trust structure established in 2009, currently valued at $18 million, with full authority over the distribution of its assets over the next 15 years, including significant annual grants that would affect all 3 children's access to supplemental distributions from the estate. Jonathan sat back in his chair. Vanessa pressed her fingers against her mouth. Michael stared at the table, not with anger, with something more complicated than that, with the particular expression of a person who has just seen themselves from the outside for the very first time. And here is what we need you to sit with for just a moment. Charles Whitmore had not simply left Evelyn a gift. He had left her authority. He had deliberately structured things so that the woman his children had thrown out of the house in garbage bags would now have a meaningful role in the future stewardship of the family's charitable legacy. He was not punishing his children. He was protecting them from their own worst instincts, from the smallness they had let themselves become, from a future where they never had to reckon with the kind of people they were, until someone who truly loved them held up a mirror. Think about what kind of man plans something like that. Think about what kind of man loves his children enough to build a correction into his own death. The months that followed were not simple. Jonathan did not take the news quietly at first. He met with his attorneys to explore whether the trust structure could be legally challenged. After 3 weeks of investigation, his attorneys told him there were no grounds. The trust was airtight. It had been airtight for 15 years. Charles had known exactly what he was doing. Jonathan eventually stopped fighting it. People who know him say it wasn't the legal wall that stopped him. It was the letter, the one Charles had written to him specifically. He has never shared what was in it. But those who've spoken to Jonathan in the months since say he is a quieter man now, more deliberate, less certain of everything. And there are people who believe that's not a bad thing. Vanessa, after a period of silence that lasted nearly 2 months, began volunteering at a community foundation in Boston that focuses on affordable housing. She didn't announce it publicly. She didn't post about it. Someone who works at the foundation mentioned it quietly to someone else, and it eventually made its way into conversation. People who know Vanessa well say she seems different, like a woman who has had to go back and recalculate something she thought she already knew the answer to. Michael enrolled in a financial recovery program 6 weeks after the will reading. He had debts he had been managing or failing to manage for years. The structured settlement from Charles's estate, paid in deliberate installments rather than a lump sum, was not what Michael had hoped for. But those who know him say that the structure may have been the most loving thing his father ever did for him specifically. A lump sum might have been gone in 2 years. The installment structure gave him a framework to rebuild inside of. As for Evelyn, she found a small apartment in Hartford. Nothing remarkable. A kitchen with a window that gets good morning light. She keeps flowers on the sill. She spends part of her time now working with the Whitmore Family Charitable Trust in her role as chairperson. She meets with community organizations, reviews grant applications, makes decisions about where the money goes and what it builds. People who have sat across from her in those meetings describe her as someone who listens more than she speaks, and who asks better questions than almost anyone else in the room. She has not spoken publicly about what happened. She has given no interviews. She has not sought any public recognition. That is not her way. It has never been her way. There was one afternoon, several months after the will reading, when Evelyn returned to the Whitmore estate. She had been asked to come for a meeting with all 3 children, the first time all of them had been in the same room since the will reading. Terrence, the old driver, was still around. He picked her up from Hartford. He said she was quiet the whole drive. When they pulled through those iron gates and up the long driveway, she looked at the stone fountain, the manicured hedges, the east and west wings. She looked at the white hydrangeas in the pot by the front door. Still blooming, still planted exactly where Margaret had put them 30 years ago. She stepped out of the car. She walked up those front stone steps. And this time, the door opened before she had to knock. Jonathan was standing in the doorway. He stepped aside to let her in. He did not say anything at first. And then he said, "I'm glad you came." Vanessa and Michael were in the main sitting room. It was a long meeting. The details of what was said in that room belong only to the people who were in it. But Terrence, who waited in the car and watched through the window, said that at some point in the afternoon he could see laughter through the glass. Real laughter. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and honest and unguarded. He said it was the first time he had ever heard that sound in that house and meant it. There is a real story that lives somewhere beneath all of this. A real woman, a real house, a real employer who valued her in ways the world didn't see until it was too late. That woman was not named Evelyn. But her story is not so different. She gave decades to a household that most people assumed she was invisible inside of. She was careful and she was present, and she understood the difference between what a person says they value and what they actually protect. And when she was gone, the truth of how much she had mattered came out in the only way it ever truly can, in writing, in a room full of people who hadn't expected it, with the weight of something irrevocable behind every word. The most valuable thing in that mansion was never the paintings. It was never the antiques, the silverware, the East Wing, the accounts, the trust, the empire. It was the woman who had kept all of it alive. Not because she was paid to, but because she understood what it meant to give your whole self to something you believed in. Even when no one was watching. Even when no one would ever know. Even when the only witness to your best moments was the man sitting across from you at a kitchen table at midnight, staring into a coffee cup that had gone cold. So we want to leave you with one final question, and we want you to really sit with it. Think about the people in your life who are quiet. The people who show up without being asked. The people who stay when it's inconvenient. The people who protect things that aren't even theirs to protect. When was the last time you looked at one of those people and actually saw them? Not thanked them out of habit. Not acknowledged them out of courtesy. Actually saw them, the full weight of who they are and what they have given. Because here is the thing about Evelyn Carter. Charles Whitmore saw her. He saw her for 38 years. He never forgot a single thing she did. And in the end, even from beyond the grave, he made sure the rest of the world saw her too. The question is, are we waiting until it's too late to do the same for the people in our own lives? Think about that, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it.